It's the winter of 1610. You're inside a wooden fort in Virginia. You haven't eaten in 2 days. There's a pair of leather boots in the corner, and you're starting to look at them differently than you did last week. Outside the walls, there's food. There's a whole continent of it. But you can't reach any of it because the people who know where it is would very much like you to leave, and the woods are full of things that want you dead, so you boil the boots. And you wonder, honestly, how it came to this. This is the story of how the first European settlers survived in America, or rather, how most of them spectacularly didn't, and how the handful who made it through pulled off one of the unluckiest, ugliest, most accidental survival stories in history. Because here's the part nobody tells you. The settlers didn't conquer America. For the first few years, America was comprehensively beating them. And the reason any of them lived long enough to have descendants comes down to a few things they got right, a lot they got catastrophically wrong, and one disease they didn't even know they were carrying. Let's start with the crossing because it set the tone. In 1607, 3 small ships left England carrying about 104 men and boys. Their plan was simple and, in hindsight, insane. Sail across an entire ocean, land on a coast nobody in the group had ever seen, and start a profitable colony for investors back home who expected gold. Not survival. Gold. These were not farmers. A lot of them were what the period charmingly called gentlemen, which meant men who considered manual labor beneath them. You can probably already see the problem. You're about to be dropped into a wilderness with a group of people, half of whom have never grown, caught, or built anything in their lives, and all of whom are convinced they're about to get rich. They landed in May and founded a settlement they called Jamestown. They picked the spot for defensive reasons. It was a peninsula, easy to guard from ships, surrounded by water. What they didn't realize was that the water was the problem. It was brackish, half salt, half stagnant, and in the summer it turned into a swamp full of disease. They had basically built their dream home inside a mosquito's mouth. And then summer ended, and the food ran out, and people started dying. By the time a supply ship arrived in early 1608, of the roughly 104 who had landed, only 38 were still alive. In less than a year, 2 out of every 3 settlers were dead. Not from war, from hunger, from bad water, from dysentery, from simply not knowing what they were doing. So how did the other 38 survive that first stretch? The answer is a man you've probably heard of, and a deal that was darker than the legend. The man was John Smith. And whatever you think of him, he understood one thing the gentleman refused to accept. If you don't work, you don't eat. He more or less said exactly that. He put everyone to labor, gentlemen included, and he did the other thing that kept the colony alive that first year. He went to the people who actually had food. The land around Jamestown wasn't empty. It belonged to a powerful network of tribes under a leader named Powhatan, with thousands of people and full storehouses of corn. The settlers survived their first winters largely by trading with them. And when trading didn't work, they took it. Sometimes they took it at gunpoint. This was not a friendship. It was a tense, shifting, increasingly hostile relationship between a tiny group of desperate foreigners and the people who held all the cards. And for a while, it held the colony together. And then John Smith got injured in a gunpowder accident and sailed back to England in 1609. And without him, the whole thing fell apart almost immediately. This is the part of the story that gets left out of the cheerful version. So if you're eating, maybe finish first. The winter of 1609 to 1610 has a name. The settlers themselves called it the starving time. Earlier that year, more ships had arrived, bringing the population up to several hundred. More mouths. And then the relationship with Powhatan's people collapsed completely into open conflict. The tribes laid siege to the fort. Anyone who left the walls to hunt or forage didn't come back. The settlers were trapped inside their own defenses with a finite amount of food and a very simple math problem. The food ran out long before the winter did. So they ate what they had. They ate the horses, then the dogs and the cats, then the rats and the mice, which, in a grim way, was at least food finding its way to them. Then they ate the leather, boots, belts, anything that had once been an animal, and when that was gone, some of them ate the dead. This isn't a rumor or a legend. In 2013, archaeologists working at Jamestown announced they had found the remains of a roughly 14-year-old girl who they nicknamed Jane. Her bones told the story directly. The cut marks on her skull and jaw were the marks of butchery. After she died, she was eaten by the starving people around her. It was a last desperate act by people who had run completely out of options inside a fort they couldn't leave. When the starving time ended in the spring of 1610, of the several hundred people who had gone into that winter, only about 60 were still alive. The survivors actually loaded onto a ship to abandon Jamestown entirely and sail home. They had given up. They were already heading down the river to leave America for good when they ran into another supply fleet coming in with food and a new governor, who ordered them to turn around and go back. That's how close the whole thing came to ending. The first permanent English colony in America survived, because the survivors of a winter of cannibalism happened to be intercepted on their way out the door. So that's Jamestown. Hold that picture in your head, because a few years later, and a few hundred miles north, a different group of settlers was about to face the same first winter. And what happened to them is the part of the story you actually got taught in school. Except the real version is stranger, and it hinges almost entirely on luck and a plague. In 1620, a ship called the Mayflower landed in what's now Massachusetts, carrying about 102 passengers. Some were religious separatists looking for a place to worship the way they wanted. Some were just along for the opportunity. They arrived in November, which is a deeply unfortunate time to arrive anywhere cold with no shelter and no idea what you're doing. And that first winter did to them roughly what Virginia had done to Jamestown. Cold, disease, and hunger killed about half of them. By spring, of the 100-odd who landed, only around 50 were left. But the Plymouth settlers had one advantage Jamestown never did, and it had nothing to do with being smarter or tougher. It was a man named Tisquantum, who history mostly remembers as Squanto. Tisquantum spoke fluent English. Sit with how strange that is for a second. These settlers had just crossed an ocean to a coast they assumed was unknown to Europeans, and within months they met a native man who could talk to them in their own language. The reason why is one of the bleakest backstories in the whole period. Years before the Mayflower ever arrived, Tisquantum had been kidnapped by an earlier English expedition and taken across the Atlantic. He learned English in captivity. He eventually made his way back home to the same coast, years later. And when he got back, his entire village was gone. Because here's the thing that actually emptied the land for the settlers. It wasn't muskets. It wasn't strategy. In the years right before the Mayflower arrived, a massive epidemic brought by earlier European contact had swept through the coastal tribes of New England and killed an enormous portion of them, by some estimates the majority. The settlers of Plymouth didn't move into a thriving, defended homeland. They moved into the aftermath of a catastrophe, onto land that had been cleared and farmed and then suddenly emptied by a disease the survivors had no defense against. The settlers even noticed the abandoned fields and the lack of people, and a few of them wrote it off as God clearing the way for them. It wasn't God. It was a virus they had carried without knowing, doing the work no army could have done. So Tisquantum, who had lost everything, ended up living with the Plymouth settlers and teaching them how to survive, how to plant local corn, where to fish, how to find food in a landscape that, to the English, was completely illegible. He also acted as a translator and a go-between with the local leader, Massasoit, whose people made an alliance with the settlers. And that alliance wasn't charity either. Massasoit's people had been hit hard by the same epidemic, and a deal with armed newcomers was a way to gain an edge against rival tribes. Everyone in this story was playing a hard game for their own survival. It just happened to keep the colony alive. That's the famous harvest feast in 1621 that we turned into Thanksgiving. The real version is two groups of people, both reeling from disaster, making a tense and temporary deal because both of them needed it. The friendly painting on the placemat leaves out the kidnapping, the plague, and the fact that the peace didn't last. So when you stack the two stories next to each other, the same brutal pattern shows up in both. The settlers who survived didn't survive because they were prepared, because they mostly weren't. They didn't survive because they were tougher than the land, because the land killed most of them. They survived because of three things: They eventually, reluctantly, learned to actually work and grow their own food instead of digging for gold. They depended on native peoples for knowledge and supplies, through trade, through pressure, and sometimes through outright theft. And they were the accidental beneficiaries of diseases that devastated the people who had lived there for thousands of years, clearing land and weakening the very groups that could have pushed them back into the sea. It was not a triumph of grit. It was survival by a thread, paid for with a staggering amount of death on every side. And yet, here's the strange thread that runs all the way to you. Those few dozen survivors at Jamestown, those 50-odd left at Plymouth, they lived. They had children. Those children had children. And the line runs unbroken all the way down, through 400 years, to a continent of people who flip on the heat, open a full refrigerator, and never once have to look at their shoes and do the math. The next time you're complaining about a cold house or a sad meal, remember that some of the people you came from once boiled their boots inside a locked fort and waited to see who'd make it to spring. They did. That's the only reason any of this is here.